So welcome everybody. My name is Durham Wong-Rieker, President and CEO of CORD, and I'm going to be joined co-host with Bill Dempster from 360 Public Affairs. And we are now at, I think this is our sixth in the webinar series for this spring. And really appreciate all of you who have been on and with us as we've gone through these series. It's the fifth, sorry about that. I misspoke a little bit there. But we are very, very excited with the fact that we've gone through some really heavy topics, as you've seen. A great session around real world evidence and what it does exist, what doesn't exist. And I think as we've gone through some of the other sessions, we've seen more refinement around that. What does it mean to be a smart drug system? And then we had over last 2 weeks ago, two really, really seminal sessions, one on patient registries and the importance of these as a real key to being able to do ongoing patient management, monitoring, collecting real world evidence, and obviously a real foundation for being able to do managed access. And then after that had a double session on the rare disease centers, which I'm going to speak a bit more about, and which are going to be really a key to our conference in June, but also hopefully people appreciate how central they are to a rare disease drug strategy. And then today is really important because it comes back to what we believe is a fundamental, and that is, for whom is a drugs program set up for, and who should be included in this? And there's some, as we know, as everybody always says, you oftentimes have to make decisions. You have to pick and choose. And so what are the rules for picking and choosing? But I think from the patient perspective, and certainly from our perspective, I think the challenge we push back is, do we pick and choose? And is there in fact an ethical imperative not to pick and choose, but to really try to address what we believe is fundamental, and that is, how do we set up a system that leaves no one behind, that everybody gets a fair chance in terms of being able to get what would be their best option? So this is what this is all about. Just really quickly, I think Bill's shown us, we have our Rare Disease Drug Conference, which is going to take place June 8th and 9th. We've been feverishly redoing the program, and I think part of it redoing it based on the feedback that we've already gotten from Health Canada and what their initial proposal might be in the first iteration of this rare drug program, as we're now calling it. And I think we will need to come back to what is it that we're going to try to really reinforce here. So just really briefly showing you kind of where the thinking is on this, Bill. I won't read you will all receive a bit more exploded description of this. Next slide there. So 8th and 9th, if you haven't made a reservation yet, if you haven't registered, please do so. We are still hoping that we can get as many people there as possible, recognizing, again, as we said, it's been a long haul. I say 20 months, we've been doing this, 36 webinars. And what we want to do at this conference is bring all of this together. It won't be all of it, because what we are recognizing is that, there are people that are not yet, I think, sharing the vision of what it is that we're trying to do. And hopefully people on this call and have been with us share that vision, that we cannot just do drugs, and that we can't just bring in drugs, but that we have to have a system that is going to be able to make sure that the right patients are getting the drugs, that they're actually being appropriately diagnosed, that there's specialists that are able to prescribe it, that are going to be ongoing monitoring for them, and that there's going to be the capacity to collect that information on a go-forward basis if we want to bring in drugs early, innovative drugs, with obviously built-in unknowns around the actual, specific benefits and long-term benefits, but they are important because there isn't anything else for many of these patients. So this is our goal, is to really see, can we get that system in place? And, and I'm hoping that this is the vision that those of you who are with us have been sharing and are willing to help push forward. Because sadly, I don't think everybody's getting the vision yet. So next slide. So I won't go this is, you can look out. Rare disease is a public health issue. And we say that over and over again, not just because of the numbers that it affects in aggregate, but because what we're designing for patients with a rare disease drug strategy, rare disease drug program, is going to be what we believe is the program for everyone. I just came back from the ISPOR conference in Washington, was on a number of panels, in a number of workshops, and especially on a couple of panels that really focused on access to medicines based on health technology assessments, but also the quality for rare diseases. And the questions that really come up is, if we can get it right for rare diseases, we can get it right for all of the medicines, innovative medicines. And also we fully recognize that there is in fact a course by which rare diseases and common diseases are going to be coming together as we have increasingly targeted precision medicines available for, genetically, genomically defined sub-patient population. So, and somebody said, but if we're carving this out for rare diseases, what does that mean for other patients as they're coming forth? And I think the answer wasn't my answer, it was somebody else's answer. It's just, let's get it right for rare diseases. Let's do the carve out. Let's look at the system there. And then we can build on it. And what works, we're going to carry it over. Because if it works for rare, it's going to work for others if it's optimal. So we're not saying carve it out, throw a bunch of money at it, and then, kind of hope that, everybody else kind of just goes away. It is, in fact, a blueprint. It's going to be a proving ground. It's going to let us do some things that are going to be important as we get into the more common conditions. So it is what we keep calling it. We need to have a smart rare drug system. We need to have something that uses not only principles of smart planning and really looks at the goal setting and the opportunities to assess not only the system, but the individual patients and the access, but also using smart technology. And I think that's going to save all of us. So we're looking at the ability to build in the digital health. We're building in the digital tools. We're building in the patient, self-help information, the ability to genuinely collect real-world evidence in real time and to transform those into usable data, shared data, usable evidence that can help us determine, okay, what's working, what's not, how well is it working. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly give you 4 case examples, but before I do that, I wonder if I should introduce our panelists. If Bill, you want to introduce our panelists, and then we'll do these very quickly 4 case examples that the panelists have been charged with actually coming up with really intelligent comments about. So think about that as you're hearing these examples and recognizing that most of you only got the examples either last night or this morning, so we're putting a lot of pressure on you. Yeah, mute, Bill.
Thanks. Happy to introduce the panel, and we'll lead some questions after you go through the case studies. So today we've got Brad Aylward, Head of Market Access and Health Policy at Indivior, also a proud board member of CORD, with lots of experience on the other side of the table in terms of negotiating these agreements. Another side of the table, we've got several folks from the innovative pharmaceuticals sector who have a lot of experience negotiating some of these complex agreements, including Shona Kinley, Director of Federal Policy and Government Affairs with Novartis. Welcome, Shona. We've got Bennett Lee, Head Value and Access at Sanofi. Bennett, great to see you. And we've got I think that's it. No, Trevor Richter, Director of Access and Reimbursement at Gilead. So this is excellent. In fact, it's interesting, and I know, Shona, you've got an extra slide to show in terms of where the new cutting edge therapies are going, and I think that's really important to. And just a heads up, we did get your slide to flash when you jump in. We also have Catherine Boivin, patient advocate, also with CORD. I think, Catherine, you're on the board of CORD as well. Is that correct? Yeah, excellent. Great to see you again. And we've got Joan Paulin, patient advocate with PHA Canada. Joan, that's pulmonary hypertension. Yeah. Sorry, now you're off.
Pulmonary arterial hypertension, Pulmonary Hypertension Association of Canada.
That's what I thought. It's always PAH or PHA. Thank you, Joan. So
no problem.
Back to you, Durhan, with case studies. Heads up, everybody. We're going to get right into it now.
Okay, so we're going to present very quickly 4 case studies, which are based on real cases, as you will recognize, and they're thinly veiled. We just didn't want to get too deep into real diseases and patients, only because we didn't want to get caught up in the nuances of them. So you've got a neuromuscular, a genetic progressive neuromuscular condition which affects, the muscles, the heart, other organs. The infants with the most severe form will display cardiac symptoms as early as 6 weeks, while those with less severe forms will develop various symptoms at ages up to early adulthood. So this fits a number of the conditions as you would know them. The treatment for this is a therapy can slow or stop disease progression, but it doesn't reverse, or cure the disease. It has been approved for patients of all ages, but the Health Technology Agency has recommended reimbursement only for children who are diagnosed and started on, therapy prior to 6 years of age, with the rationale that, number one, these are going to be the kids that are going to be most severe since they actually did have the disease early on. Secondly, they would therefore be able to have the most benefit from them. Oh, sorry, the first point was actually this was the population reflected in the clinical trials. The clinical trials are done with children under 6 years of age. This would, these are the severe forms. They're going to have the most benefit in terms of being able to gain health from it. And thirdly, there's the greatest experience, with this group of patients. They've been studied the longest, and they require relatively small amounts of the drugs. It's a weight-based drug, so it's going to be, the drug may be limited. It's also going to be costly, less costly if you're small. Older patients can get access on a case-by-case basis, but the approval has been varied, quite frankly, a lot by jurisdiction. So hang that on mind. Second case we're going to put at you very quickly is another genetic base, is a progressive respiratory condition, affects quality of life, leading to early death. Until a few years ago, it was treated primarily by antibiotics and just symptom management. There was no treatment. The first approved treatment was targeted for a specific genetic mutation affecting only 5% of the population. The new therapies, the combination therapies, which have come on based on some of that same technology, are effective for up to 90% of the genotype. So we go from 5 to 90. However, there are in fact limits or lots of variation in terms of the individual response, with complete response to, marginal response. So it's a little bit more challenging in terms of, predicting exactly who in that 90% is actually going to demonstrate complete benefit from it. It is, however, a therapy that's, again, because it's new, there's very little long-term evidence of how well it works. And in some cases, we have seen, as we say, remarkable results, even reversing some of the damage. In others, patients do not seem to get much benefit. So this is a real challenge. And while some of the private drug plans are making it available, because it is an expensive therapy, we find that many of the private patients are not able to actually afford it because they can't afford the copay. Next. Got another example. This is a drug that was approved about 12 years ago. It's the first treatment for an ultra rare blood disorder. So by now it's off patent, it's genericized, and it may be produced around the world by different companies. But the original drug actually now has a number of other indications based on the underlying mechanism of action. Some of this, at least one of them, is a relatively large non-rare patient population. Which again, works well, but there are other therapies that are available for this larger patient population. Drug price was negotiated when it was still a truly orphan drug for a very small patient population. Drug plans are coming back and say, hey, we need to renegotiate this price. We need to come back with a different pricing based on what they see is the alternatives for the large patient population that could also benefit from it. Third one, I know this is a lot to go through, but hopefully people are kind of somewhat familiar with these things. This is a disease that affects about 300 individuals in Canada, so still somewhat, really small patient population. The only therapy that's available is this old drug. It's used for a number of conditions. It no longer has a patent, but there is only one manufacturer, maybe because it's an old drug or not a whole lot of profit to it. The therapy is effective in managing the symptoms, but it does not treat the underlying condition. The biggest challenge is that it's difficult to administer, requiring slow infusion with a pump overnight. The new formulation is an oral therapy, taken once a day. In the clinical trials, it was demonstrated to be non-inferior to the original therapy, meaning that it didn't work better, and it was not developed to intend to work better. It was developed to provide a much better way of administering the same drug to the patients. Obviously, most of the patients say they would prefer the oral therapy, but it was turned down by the HTA agency for several reasons. First, they said there is no greater efficacy, so we don't see an improved outcome. There is greater convenience, they do concede. The calculated incremental cost effectiveness ratio, then the ICER, the comparison of the cost per additional life year compared to the old drug was actually really, really high, and certainly higher than what has emerged from the HTA agency as something that, it's referred to, I think, in payer environments as the willingness to pay. How much are you willing to pay to give a patient an additional year of life? And somewhere in history, there emerged this magical number that said we'll pay $50,000 for each additional year of life, quality adjusted year of life that the patient might get. If the drug costs more than that to deliver an extra year of life, we don't pay it. Or we ask for a lower price. If it costs less than that, well, that's good. It's good to go. So this is the challenge. When we do the calculations for this drug, because there is no greater efficacy, so the quality of life is really dependent on the fact that patients actually have a much better, it's more convenient for them. It's actually quite high, much higher than what would be traditional willingness to pay. And the budget impact, even for a small number of patients, is well over $1 million a year. So those are the 4 cases. We can flip back and forth to them, but hopefully you hold them in your head there. And the questions we want to ask the panel is, okay, how do we want to approach this? And as you know, these are realistic, somewhat composite cases that are based on what actually happens in Canada. And some of you who are on the call or manufacturers of this, will have had these experiences. One of the solutions has been to have a managed access program, especially for innovative therapies where there's a variation of response. And we start people on it, we see how well it works, and then we keep them on if it works. If it doesn't work, then we move into something else. We also have had huge discussions around, can we actually have something like a $50,000 for quality adjusted life year, regardless of the disease that we're thinking of? Is it the same for, patients that have a very common condition, including things like, I don't want to say heartburn is a trivial condition, but, something that is, a fairly common condition versus something that is very, very, not only uncommon, but very severe, very difficult. And there's been lots of introductions of how do we modify that 50K. In England, in the UK, they have said, okay, for an ultra rare condition, we'll go up to 300,000K. Other countries have said we'll go up to about 80,000K based on some calculations. Other ones said, look, we don't change the K. We just look at it in terms of some moderations of it. So it doesn't meet the quality, but hey, there's other extenuating circumstances. And so when we vote as to whether or not we recommend it or not, we recognize it doesn't meet the economic impact, but we will in fact maybe vote yes, because it rings some other bells. It's severe, it's progressive, there's no other treatments, the number of patients is small. So that's kind of where it is. And of course, with many of the processes, patient input, especially in the form of qualitative information, gives that kind of information to a committee to say, hey, let's give it some other kinds of reviews or recommendations based on what's there. The challenge with that approach, of course, is that it doesn't lead to consistency. And it doesn't lead to consistency from one drug to the other, one disease to the other, even one committee to the other. So that's a big challenge as well. How do you institutionalize a decision-making process where there are methods for doing it, but they're so complex that you have to be in, I don't know, I was going to say a PhD, but you have to be certainly something beyond your ordinary person to actually make those calculations. So this is where we are. This is what we're asking of you. I'm going to stop there, Bill, and flip it over to you and take the discussion through with our esteemed panel, who are going to try to look brilliant as they answer these very challenging questions that certainly you and I couldn't answer.
Yeah, no, thanks, Durhan. That's the reason why we have these webinars. and it's more than just the panel of esteemed experts that we have here. We have lots of people on the line as well. Please use the chat panel effectively to provide inputs, comments, etc. We roll those up, and they're very useful as we move forward to June. So here's what we're going to do for the panel discussion. We'll go through these as themes, and we'll jump around a bit. Feel free to talk amongst each other as well. What does leave no one behind mean in these scenarios for you? And really open who wants first. Well, Sophie's choice, right? Who's going to get what. These are very challenging decisions that, Brad, I know you had to sit around and make decision on, but how are these decisions made? What does leave no one behind actually mean in reality? I don't know, Brad, if you want to start as somebody who had to make these choices a while back, but it might be now for you to go for it first.
Sure, yeah, I'll take a stab, Bill, and hope the audio is okay. Yours was breaking up a little bit on the way out. I think, and I'll speak from kind of my previous role working with one of the public payers. As you alluded to, this, all of these scenarios present challenging problems for drug plan managers who are, their responsibility, what they're charged with, is to try and maximize limited resources to the greatest benefit of population. So, there's kind of a tension built into that because it's really challenging for someone whose responsibility is to think in terms of population to allow themselves to even be, kind of brought down to the individual level. So that's a challenge, certainly, with the function. I don't mean to sound rude or in any way kind of crass, but from kind of a public decision-making standpoint, I don't think there's even the luxury to think in those terms. And it's not because the people that are involved don't want to. It's because, choice and making trade-offs and living with, I guess, inequities, not just in drug access, but in all elements of healthcare, and perhaps many of the elements in which governments are responsible for. I think there's a desire and certainly a philosophical draw to ensure that nobody is left so far behind that they're completely forgotten about. But I guess from a payer standpoint, there has to be perhaps some guardrails, some criteria, some sequencing, not necessarily so that a single decision is made and that's it for once and for all, but so that there can be kind of checkpoints along the way. So maybe a better way of saying it is that what the public payers often struggle with is certainly they don't want to leave everyone behind, but there's often an inability to bring everybody along all at the same time, at the same speed. So maybe I'll pause there and let others kind of comment.
Thanks, Brad. It reminds me a bit of, I remember Brent Fraser when he was at the Ontario Drug Plan at our conferences. Sometimes it would be a very odd case from the floor and he'd say, come and talk to me afterwards, right? And so there often was room to try to deal with special or challenging cases. Trevor, I don't know if you want to jump in, given both where you are today, but where you were even just a couple of years ago with Cadith, and some of the papers that you've written about how to incorporate new ways to deal with uncertainty, especially around rare. I remember you were on a paper that really did help bring in some new criteria for consideration at Cadith. How did you handle that then, and how are you seeing this evolve in terms of your new role at Gilead and some of the new technologies coming forward?
Thanks, Bill. So I guess, in my new role at Gilead, I think a common theme that we're experiencing, where we have populations and treatments that treat very small numbers of patients who don't fit the classic definition of a rare disease, but nevertheless fit a lot of those criteria in terms of being small populations with no other treatment option. When it comes to my previous experience at Cardiff, I think we're seeing a common theme in terms of people focusing in on the role of Cardiff in particular, but the HTAs in this space when, I guess I'm free of the shackles of Cardiff. And I know you've had Brent on and Alex Chambers, so I hope I'm not going to be discordant with what they've said, but I actually think that Cardiff has done a really good job in evolving within its constraints to meet some of these challenges. I think what people fail to appreciate quite often is that Cardiff and the HTAs are not setting policy for this or any other area in healthcare, right? They really have to act within the constraints that on the one hand, I actually used to have a slide which had the federal government on the one side and the PTs, the payers on the other side, and Cardiff being kind of stuck in the middle, right, between a rock and a hard place. And that's really where they have to operate. And I think they've done a good job in accommodating, an increasingly strong patient voice, flexibility around inclusion of the patient views as well as clinicians throughout the process. And even when it comes to discussions of the ICER, which in my current organization is a really hot topic, particularly dealing with the thresholds that are in play, you've got to understand that Cardiff is simply acting within the constraints that they're bound by, and these are set by the public payers, right? So it's a matter of picking your battles, and ICER thresholds, I would suggest are probably the least of everyone's problem right now. I think the elephant in the room really comes down to what Brad was alluding to. Try not to leave everyone behind when you have a fixed budget as a payer, right? And the elephant in the room is always the cost, and it's not the cost per quality, it's the total cost. And I think when you look at trying to pick some battles, that might be one avenue to explore, is how do we manage the total costs for the payers? And there might be a role for Cardiff in there because they don't make decisions based on budget or cost. It's a factor that is included in their recommendations, but it's not a decision point. Could that be changed? Well, I think again that gets back to the payers and potentially, I'll cut my comment short now. I don't want to take up too much time, but potentially the role that the federal government could play in there to alleviate that as being an issue.
Well, thanks. Let's jump over to some of the patient advocates on the line then, because you noted that the patient voice has been heard and it's led to some evolutions within Cardiff in terms of their systems and processes. And you pointed some potential opportunities for change at the provincial and territorial levels, which are basically the primary governance leadership of Cardiff in many ways. Catherine and Joan, do you feel that Cardiff has heard you as you both educated yourself on this and advocated at the front lines? And then what do you think about Trevor's idea of taking some of these threshold challenges to the provinces to sort of walk them through some of these case studies potentially? What did you hear from Brad and Trevor that really struck you? Go for it, John.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Trevor said. And I just want to give a bit of a patient perspective to what leave no one behind means. And I think from a patient perspective, it means that all patients should have access to all approved medicines. It's a simple answer to the question. No matter where you live in this country, if there's an approved medicine for your rare disease, you should have access to it. That doesn't mean that you should be prescribed that medicine, because it might not work for you, but it does. All we want initially is to get access, equal access across this country. That's all. That's the first thing. The next thing I think that's really important is to understand that in order to get, I think patients, rare disease patients, understand that some of the treatments that are coming down the pipe are not going to work for all of the patients within their disease. Gene mutation, gene therapy is going to work for specific gene mutations and not all patients within that disease space. So what I think it's important, and again, I think patient organizations understand this as well, that it's important, I think, in the rare disease space to have more of the decision-making moved downstream to the clinicians. I think that or move the clinicians upstream so that there's actually an expert within that disease space on the expert panel, and that person can actually help, and patients as well. They should also be there, a patient. And I think Trevor, CADTH is doing that. They are making the effort to do that. I think certainly from a patient perspective, the reality of it is we need more clinician involvement upstream so that they can make decisions. They can be the expert at the table that says, okay, this is where I think this drug is going to work in my community. This is where it's not going to work. And even though it's not maybe being trialed or investigated in a specific clinical trial, it might actually, the clinicians may have an idea of which patients they think might actually benefit from that treatment beyond what is being currently done in the clinical trial. And so we need to use clinicians and patient experiences a little bit more maybe. And I know that's a difficult ask because that is, I don't know exactly how that works, but I think if we want to be a more patient-centered healthcare, then we need to involve clinicians and patients more in the decision-making process, both upstream and downstream.
Yeah, one of the ideas that we're going to hear a lot about in June is the centers of excellence, or the network centers across the country, where you're actually moving some of the decision-making downstream to the clinicians and the patients. Can the funding go there as well to provide access to a broader range of medicines, as opposed to trying to solve everything at the national level? Catherine, you've been honestly on these issues. Like, what struck you from the case studies and from what you just heard about that really resonated? And do you think we're on the right track? And share with us where you think we're going, having been a leader on this over the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I agree with about everything that Joan said. And, upstream, downstream, I tend to favor the outlook of upstream, in the sense of upstreaming clinicians and patients earlier on in the process, because right now we have a very staggered step-by-step process in access to treatments, where we get stuck on obstacles of restrictive clinical trial population groups, and that's where people get left behind. So I think that we need to have foresight in those decisions and in those recommendations. Yes, CADTH are taking steps to improve their engagement with clinicians and patients, but we still have cases and some very, very timely cases in our community, in the SMA community, where we have adults who could benefit from treatments that are currently accessible in Canada, but who aren't getting access because they don't fit the criteria that was recommended by CADTH in certain provinces. Whereas at the federal level, Health Canada approved treatments for all populations and all ages. So I recently read a story of a young man who's in his 20s who has type 3 SMA, and up to his early adulthood was fairly functional and had a good outlook on life, was optimistic about treatments coming in, and thought that he would benefit from those treatments to stop or delay the progression of his disease. And now, because of where he lives, that optimism is gone because he is not allowed access to a drug that could keep him fit and active and able to work and able to care for his family, able to lift his children, instead of, seeing a downward spiral of progression and ending up in a wheelchair, no longer being able to go upstairs, which means he needs an adapted living environment, an adapted work environment. All of these costs, add up down the line to the system and for the patients as well. So when we talk about budget impact of a drug or of a treatment, well, what is the budget impact of not treating certain patients?
Yeah,
I have an answer to that.
I don't know if Trevor, you want to jump back in there really briefly on, because, and we could get into this with Bennett and with Shona too, because that's, you mentioned the elephant in the room, and budget is what Catherine's mentioning considered in a budget impact analysis.
So I'll keep it brief. In a nutshell, no, not explicitly, and that's part of the problem, and that could definitely be improved. In the end, the perspective taken by the HTAs is per direction of their funders, the public payers, really pretty restricted to looking at the impact of the cost of the drug itself. So there is a lot of opportunity to broaden that perspective, I would agree.
Thanks, Trevor. That's great. Let's bring it, to Shona, just bring it back to the impacts clinically, and then we'll bring it back to you, Bennett, because I think that you've got lots of experience on the core issues back in the case studies, and I know that's where you want to end up, right? Durhan, is like, how do we create a smart plan that resolves these issues? But maybe we'll start with you, Shona, because just bringing it back to a patient experience, I know that's the one slide you want to share. Why don't you share that?
Thanks, Bill. Sure. If you can pull up the slide while I'm speaking. I thank you, and I can see the slide, and I hope everyone can too. I just wanted to share this because I thought it was in keeping with today's theme of leaving no one behind. I wanted to share this with everyone. This lady that you see in front of you, this young lady, her name is Emily Whitehead, and she was in fact the first global patient enrolled in a pediatric trial for CAR T therapy. And that was 10 years ago in 2012. And you can see Emily on the left when she was first enrolled in the study. And she came into this clinical trial after failing on, the current treatments that were available for the current traditional cancer treatments for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And so her parents really had exhausted all avenues, and then they ended up at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and a real revolutionary physician named Dr. Stephen Grupp was looking at this CAR T technology, and she was enrolled as the first pediatric patient. And it really is quite remarkable. She was enrolled, and here we are 10 years later. As of last week, she celebrated her 10-year milestone of being cancer-free after being treated with CAR T therapy. And I wanted to share that with everyone because I think it is along the same lines of what we're talking about today, like leave no one behind. Emily, at the time of this innovative treatment, she had no other options, and she was fortunate to live where she did live, to be enrolled in a very breakthrough technology type of clinical trial, and it has changed the trajectory of her life. And so let's bring it back home to Canada, where we are now. And I did want to pick up on one of the points that Brad made. And when Brad worked for the province of Nova Scotia, governments are faced with choices, and we have limited resources, and yet we have to make choices that are life and death, or the governments do on behalf of us. They make these decisions. And could you imagine if we didn't have CAR T therapy at this stage, because patients are living normal lives after being treated. And the same goes for many of these therapies that we're talking about. And it changes the trajectory of people's lives. But yet back 10 years ago, do we have the tools or the qualities to examine it? No, we didn't. We had to look at it in a very different way. And that would be my message, is that these new innovative therapies that are coming to the market, we can't just put them in a little box and expect a quality or an HD outcome. We have to sit down with the payers and the jurisdictions and have real meaningful conversations around affordability and how can we make this work within your system.
That's really well said, Shona, and a great segue to Lee, Bennett, with so first we have it. That's the way your name is up on the screen. Sorry, Bennett. Okay. Sanofi was at the forefront of interjurisdictional negotiations back in the day for Fabry's disease, among other things. And since then, I mean, you've been a leader in rare disorders. You know, what have you seen through all of those discussions and dialogues and challenges and opportunities that can help sort of wrap it up, especially around some of the hurdles that were brought forward in the case studies that Durhan presented? Or you know, just share with us where you think we can go in a positive way to actually address those hurdles.
Great, thanks, Bill, and I just want to thank Durhan and Cord for holding these webinars, because it's important for us to have these dialogues together, for us to understand what the issues are and to come together with proposing solutions. And you know, I'm hearing other panelists speak about what the payers are looking for and what guardrails they need to have in place in order for them to make decisions, you know, looking at budget impact or qualities or health economics. But we can't leave anyone behind. And, you know, as citizens, as patients, we need to continue to advocate to government, to payers in terms of prioritization. Yes, we need to have, you know, work with the payers to help them to plan their budget, to help them understand the value of the medicines that we're bringing to treat patients. But at the same time, if there's a will, there's a way as well, in helping the payers to justify and prioritize what makes sense for the patients and the healthcare system. And Bill, you mentioned that, you know, the work that Sanofi has done on Fabry disease, and we worked and partnered with government, with academics, to come up with an evidence generation program, because early on there wasn't enough evidence at that point in time for government to say, well, what is the long-term benefit of this? And so there was that opportunity for us to work collaboratively with multiple stakeholders to collect that evidence over that period of time, because, you know, a lot of or some of the case studies that you've presented is because some of the clinical trials are done in a short period of time, for example, because of necessity and for a specific patient population. In order to study and have all the data available for the lifetime of the patient, you need to run a clinical trial program with thousands of patients over, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, and that's just not possible. So I hear some of the proposals that was discussed by the panel, and Brad, you mentioned a managed access program or an evidence generation type of program. We as industry, we look forward to that. We want to be able to partner and work with government to collect real world data, but some of the barriers are also at the payer level because they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the ability to do that. And at the payer level, all they're looking at is dollars and cents. And that's a shame. And I think we need to change the dialogue, but also work with the payers in helping them create that infrastructure to collect that data over time. So that, yes, we may have a clinical trial that demonstrated it's the benefit of a drug for a certain segment of the population, but if you want to treat, you know, older children or an indication where it may not quite fit the study design, then as you know, as an industry and as stakeholders, we should be willing to come up with some sort of risk sharing agreement that allows us to collect that data, give access to patients, and for clinicians to use that drug in the population that they feel it's appropriate, and then we collect that data over time. And yes, if the data proves itself, well, great, it's funded, the patient's treated, they're benefiting. If it doesn't show the benefit that that was initially intended, then there should be some sort of risk sharing arrangement with the manufacturer to have some sort of reverse compensation. So we need to have that dialogue, and we need to have the infrastructure in place.
Thanks, Bennett. And maybe back to you, Durhan, in terms of, because you were right at the forefront of the Fabry's case and issue, and making sure that it was a research protocol around it was actually how it unlocked some money from the federal level. And so risk sharing became a tripartite agreement, right, between manufacturer, provinces, and the feds. Is there something there for the SMART plan, do you think? Because I know you've been getting some questions about research. Do you think they can go in that direction, or where do you think we're going next on what Bennett just said?
Well, I mean, what Bennett said and what Sean was saying, what I think everybody's saying is exactly right. You know, what are the solutions for getting those drugs to the patient so they can try? I mean, that's what Joan just said, right? Everybody should at least be able to get access. And, you know, at the meeting I was just at yesterday, in fact, some of these questions came up, you know, would industry be willing to risk share? I mean, what we're hearing over and over again, and certainly with the Fabry's decision, there was a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? Industry funded 1/3, federal government funded 1/3 as research because they didn't want to pay for the drugs, and the provinces funded 1/3 because they were paying for the therapies. And, you know, in the research component, you know, run through CHR was actually to collect that information, put together the registries, and then be able to analyze to say what works or doesn't. And I've spoken with many of the researchers, clinicians that are in that, that Fabry initiative that say, yeah, we learned a great deal in terms of which patients for which whom it worked, et cetera. We didn't actually act on all of it, but, you know, we did to have the information. So that is, you know, I think a strong part of the proposal. And again, I'm really thrilled to hear what Bennett is saying, and that is, you know, that we need to invest in the infrastructure. And I think those of you who have heard me speak around the proposal that just came down from Health Canada, and I know I'm not telling tales out of school because we've spoken to them directly about it, the idea that we would fund drugs with some kind of a list of drugs without recognizing we need the infrastructure, that's actually almost criminal, but it's a waste of money. And the other thing that came up is, you know, where does this money come from? Well, I think all of you would know the right answer is we quit funding the things that don't work. We get rid of, you know, including therapies that we keep putting out there, including patients that we keep giving therapies to without coming back to say, is this really working? Is it worthwhile? Even if sometimes those are seen as old therapies, small therapies, the fundamentals of the system have got to be that, yes, we're going to be able to identify the right patient, get them the right therapy. That's why I say this rare disease strategy is a proving ground, you know, in terms of what we could do. And you and I both know that if we were to actually stop funding all the drugs that don't work, and we stop funding all the patients who are not actually getting optimal value out of those drugs or even taking the drugs, we would have buckets of money to fund buckets of rare diseases. So, you know, don't say that there isn't money in the system. We're just unwilling to reallocate, to look hard at what we need to do. This is our chance to get it right. We can do that. You know, give us a clean slate and let's start it.
Yeah, thanks, Durhan. And then open to the panel, especially around, you know, the idea of this national evaluation system, the budget impact analysis, the cost per qualities, that's on the economic side. And Bennett, you really brought up some interesting points about, you know, the clinical data that influences the economics. Can some of these decisions be brought down to the institutional level, or do they all have to happen at the national and pan-Canadian level? That's a question I have. Like, could some of these decisions be a little bit closer to the patient and the clinician, be informed by CADTH? I think this is leading into where we're going in June and what we've done over the last 36 webinars, Durhan, and having national centers of excellence. And just wondering, can we get some of these decisions closer to the patients and the clinicians possibly? Or do we have to stay pan-Canadian and national?
Well, I could jump in. I didn't hear anyone else speaking there. I just wanted to build on the last comment from Durhan, and that was from what Bennett was saying. I think, you know, if we look at my organization, which is Gilead, well, the company that we have in the CAR T space is Kite, like Novartis. We have CAR T therapies. If we look at the international status of these therapies, Kite/Gilead has in place very innovative agreements all over the world, right? France, Italy, other jurisdictions have agreements in place that are quite innovative and based on outcomes that kind of address these issues that Bennett was alluding to. And Canada really is an outlier there. So when we talk about, leaving someone behind, without sounding flippant, I think Canada's being left behind internationally. If you look at what is being done internationally, Canada really is looking like it is being left behind. And it really, in the end, it's Canadian patients that are being left behind. So I think there's definitely a lot that can be learned from what's going on internationally, if we can just, keep the pressure on the stakeholders to not avoid this issue and to address it. And that's why, I personally am a strong supporter of this kind of forum and the work that Dirhan is doing to keep essentially trying to hold stakeholders to account.
Joan, jump in and then bring it back to Dirhan, because I think you raised some really neat ideas there, Trevor. Joan.
Yeah, and I'm just going to follow on to that a bit. I mean, if we want to get earlier access to new therapies, I think we need to look at some of the European countries like Germany and France. I mean, they use budget impact thresholds and unmet needs to determine whether or not a drug can get approved immediately upon or almost immediately upon approval. Why can't we do that? And then I think budget impact threshold and willingness to pay are two different arguments. And I think if we get a drug almost immediately approved because it meets those two criteria, the unmet need criteria and the is below there, and it should be a reasonable budget impact threshold, not something really silly. We're talking in some cases, very innovative drugs. But the reality of it is, once we've made that decision to get the drug in the hands of patients, then we need to make a decision about willingness to pay. And that decision is less about economics and more about value factors, value measurements. What does it mean in terms, this is my personal opinion. I'm not sure that that's maybe airy fairy stuff, but it should, our willingness to pay, if we look at the 4 disease states that we were talking about earlier, willingness to pay is going to depend on each disease state. It's not going to be a number. It's going to be, what does that treatment do to that particular patient population, and how much are we willing to pay for that treatment for that particular patient population? And the answers to those questions will be different in every disease space, because the things that we should be looking at are things like quality of life improvements, changes to a reduced need for other health care support systems, caregiver, whether people are able to continue working or go back to work. All of these things are going to be so different within each disease space that our willingness to pay also has to be, I think, something that is not it is in terms of rare disease. We're not one size fits all. It's going to be, I just think it has to be more tailored to each individual disease state. And I don't know how exactly we do that. I just think a willingness to pay is not a one size fits all.
Thanks so much. Yes, Catherine, you had your hand up. Jump in.
Well, just really quickly to reinforce what Joan was saying, definitely qualities and other, sort of restrictive measurements and methods don't really reflect the real value and the real world value and the real world impact that some of these innovative therapies and treatments for rare disorders provide. And also, just to bring it back quickly to, the question of infrastructure, and data, and how we evaluate, and what evidence we use to evaluate the effectiveness of these therapies or the expanded indications of these therapies. We're talking about what's being done in Europe and elsewhere in the world. I think we also need to be able to look at evidence and data coming in from those parts of the world, and not only base ourselves on what we can generate and collect here in Canada, but what's been generated and collected elsewhere as well to support our decisions, because really, the rare disease patients are the same, have the same conditions in Canada as elsewhere in the world. So that's also part of building efficiency into the system.
Well, and that's Durhan. We have an ambassador both externally, and then you bring everything back internally, which is great. How do you want to wrap this one up, and what do you think so far? You're on mute.
We're going to put a placeholder on this discussion because we're going into the June conference. I know, Joan, you're not going to be there. I'm really sad about that, but I know your colleague Jamie's going to be there, so we'll carry this on. The reason we do these webinars is to get started on these discussions, right? And we're going to do more in the conference. The good news and bad news, as some of you will know, we were really disappointed when the first, we got this list of drugs, this idea of a formulary from Health Canada as the starting point. And if they even just listening to this discussion would understand from multiple stakeholders, we're all saying the same things, right? We need to set up a system that would allow us to get these drugs to people in a way that we can assess whether or not they're working, and having experts at the top level as well as on the ground that can do it. I think that's kind of what we're all aiming for. So we have the conference in June. What we're going to do for the summer is we're going to do a series of actual workshops. And now that people are actually coming together again, what I'd like to do is to do some workshops that will be both in person and virtual, and try to do that blend. We also had the opportunity to bring in some experts from outside the country. I mean, I was just at ISPOR, I was over at Garrett, I was at going out to Bio, later this month. Everybody is actually interested in what Canada's doing. So, Trevor, this is our opportunity, as we say in the patient community, go from worst to first. Can we kind of get ourselves out of, the kind of mess that we're in, where, we've got these really, kind of, we're the outlier at the bad end, and we can be the outlier at the front end. This is our opportunity, but I need everybody to kind of come together, to come back to Health Canada and say, no, we're not going to accept the formulary. We do not want a list. We need to have real investments in an infrastructure. We're going to bring up the leaders from the Centers of Excellence in the US and also Europe again, and the global environment, who are going to tell us, how this can fit into what we're looking at globally. Marshall Summer, who I just met at the National Children's Hospital, who runs the National Rare Disease Research Institute in Washington, comes up. He wants to partner. He sees Canada as a great place for us to be investing in this. So, we have all the opportunities. So I really appreciate very much what everybody said here. Unfortunately, we're not done. We're going to be having the opportunity to do many more of this. And in some respects, I think this becomes sort of an ongoing dialogue. Should we not have an ongoing series of expert discussions? And wouldn't it be amazing if, in fact, as these therapies came in, we could have an expert group who might talk about, what's the best way to bring in this therapy? What are the ways in which outside of, and, in addition to something like a CADIS or something like, the regulators, that it would be really, driven by those in the community. So I'd love to think about how we can move forward with this, and really want to thank everybody. All 6 panelists here were just brilliant. And thank you, Bill, as usual, for really, walking us through this. This was great. So hopefully you can see as many of you as possible in June in Ottawa, and we're going to carry on the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody. Happy long weekend.
Happy long weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.